Welcome back to the Bootstrap tutorial series, and this video on Bootstrap layout. Before you start applying Bootstrap components in your code, it's critical to understand the Bootstrap layout concepts and components such as breakpoints, containers, and the grid system. Breakpoints are customizable widths that determine how your responsive layout behaves across devices or viewport sizes. As discussed in the responsive design video in my CSS playlist, media queries are used to conditionally apply CSS styles to HTML elements. By default, Bootstrap comes with 6 predefined breakpoints, extra small through extra large. And looking at this table, you can see the browser width dimensions for each media query breakpoint. Containers are fundamental building blocks in Bootstrap. They contain, pad, and align your content within a device or viewport. Bootstrap comes with 3 types of containers. The default container, which sets a max width at each responsive breakpoint. A container in which you specify a breakpoint, which sets the width of the container to 100% until the specified breakpoint is reached. And fluid container, which maintains a width of 100% at all breakpoints. As you can see from this table, the containers with specified breakpoints match the 6 predefined breakpoints we discussed previously. Finally, the Bootstrap grid system is used to build responsive layouts which are contained within a 12-column grid. The grid system uses a series of containers, rows, and columns to lay out and align content on a page. We'll take a deeper look into the grid system as we build out our web pages using Bootstrap, but for now, I'll copy this example and paste it into our index.html file. Then I'll add some styles so we can see the grid on the page. I know using block style isn't best practice, but it'll do for this demo. Now, it's important to point out that the style that I'm adding, whether it's a block style or if I had used an external style sheet, your custom styles must come after the link that includes the Bootstrap styles. And that's because of the cascading effect of style sheets. Putting the Bootstrap styles first will load them into the browser and apply those styles to the HTML elements. So when this page starts to render and it hits this div with a class of container, that class is the Bootstrap container class that we get from the Bootstrap CSS. Then there's a div with a class of row, so it's a single container with a single row. The row is a Bootstrap class. And then the same for the 3 divs with the class of column have Bootstrap column classes. Then we apply our styles. So here I'm saying find the div with the class of row and add to the styles that Bootstrap provides a 1 pixel solid red border. And for the elements with the class of column, add to the default Bootstrap styles a 1 pixel solid black border. Going back down to the HTML, this div, as we said, has a class of container, and that's one of 3 container styles provided by Bootstrap. This is the default container, so this div with the container will take up the maximum viewport size inside of the browser. If we go back to the browser, we now see 1 row with 3 columns. And if we inspect this in Developer Tools, expand the body, here's our div with the class of container. Inside of the container, we have the div with the class of row. And then inside of the div with the class of row, we have the 3 divs with the class of column. And as we resize this, the columns will resize appropriately due to Bootstrap's responsiveness. So the way Bootstrap grid system works is that it supports 6 responsive breakpoints, the 6 we previously discussed. Containers are used to center and horizontally pad page content. And page content is contained in columns, which are children of rows wrapped inside a container. There is a maximum of 12 columns per row, and unless you specifically indicate how many columns a specific column should use, all the columns in the row will be equally spaced. So going back to our example, since we have 3 columns in our row, each column will take up 4 of the 12 available columns in the grid. If we copy this code and then double the number of columns in the row and go back to the browser, we'll see that our second row has 6 columns. Each of the columns take up 2 of the available columns in the 12 columns in the grid. And if we add another row and double these, Our third row now has 12 columns, each of which take up one column in the grid, and they're all responsive. One change I'd like to make in the code is to use a single container to wrap all 3 rows. So I'll collapse the rows, then delete the closing tag for the first container and the opening tag for the second. Do the same for the second container. Save this and go back to the browser, and we have the same result. So we don't necessarily need multiple containers to contain rows. We can add as many rows as required inside of a single container. So as we just saw, when we add columns to a row, if we don't specify the width or the breakpoint, each column in the row will be given an equal width. So in this example here, they have a row with 2 columns. Each column takes up 6 of the 12 available columns in the grid. The second row obviously has 3 columns, each of which take up 4 columns in the grid. In order to set a specific width for a column or columns, inside of the class attribute, instead of just setting the value to call, you specify the number of columns you want that div to take up out of the grid. So in this first example, they have a row with 3 columns. The middle div has a class value of call6. So that says out of the 12 available columns, I want this one in the center to take up 6 of those. The div that comes before it has a class of call, as does the div that comes after. So since this center div takes up 6 of the 12, that means there are 6 remaining. So the divs with the class of call split the remaining, and they each get 3. In the second example here, they have a row, again with 3 divs. The div in the center has a call of 5. So in this case, the center div will get 5 of the available columns, and then the divs that surround it will share the rest of the viewable area on that row. I highly recommend taking some time to read through the layout documentation pages on the Get Bootstrap site before moving on to the next video, where we'll look at Bootstrap components.